Welcome into another episode of Discard for Magic. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm your host, James or Jackson, and today we're cheerful to have on Cherez to come talk about the Storm Goblins.
Hello.
So, Cherez, why don't you, before we jump into the Storm Goblins, just give us like a little bit of your backstory of how you found out about Summoner Wars?
Yeah, I think it was the winter of 2020. I was looking for, so I usually go back to my parents' place, and there I don't really have any access to any computers or really anything to do outside of like walk outside. But there is a good board game shop nearby. I was looking for a good 2-player board game to play with my sister. That said, my sister doesn't really play too many board games, so I was like, my eyes kind of got bigger than my brain, I guess is the best way of putting it, where I went to the board game store. I was like, can you show me some cool 2-player games, showing me around. And then he showed me Summoner Wars, and I just got really excited about the fact that, you know, there's all these different decks you can play, all these different combinations you can do together. And I immediately bought it, realizing that my sister, you know, her experience with board games is like limited to, I guess, Settlers of Catan, which is a great game, but definitely not as complicated as Summoner Wars. It was fun, but I had to sort of explain to her, you know, what does health mean? What does, you know, movement mean? You know, similar, just basic board game concepts.
And she's secretly one of the best players on the server. We just don't know it.
It'd be crazy. So that was second edition, I take it?
Yeah, it was second edition. I have not ever played first, but it does sound very interesting. I'd love there to be like a retro, like I don't think I'd play it for a long time based off what I've heard, but it would be cool to just have like a weekend of just 1E.
I think the easiest way would probably do that would probably be like get together on Tabletop Simulator or something, because I think people have put it on there, but I don't know. I've never really sought it out, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds like it would be a lot.
Not a whole lot of reason to go back to first edition at this point, but what are some other board games that you tend to play? Like, did you find other 2-players when you guys were at that board game shop, or did you just like play Summoner Wars after gravitating towards it?
My family's really into Blockus, I guess, and also Spy Alley. Those are the 2 games my family plays probably the most together. Not sure if they're the most balanced games, but they are a lot of fun to play with my family and other random people. Other than that, like I said, Settlers of Catan, one of my good friends from high school actually in COVID decided to like run like a 30-person, all his friends, like Settlers of Catan League. That's a lot of fun. Scythe, Gloomhaven, and then recently actually I've been playing a lot of, I think it came out earlier this year or last year, the new Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second. That game's really fun.
A board game?
Yep.
I'm always a little hesitant about IP board games because most of them I feel like don't turn out, but occasionally you'll get one that's like really, really good.
I still have to play my copy, but I played a Slay the Spire board game my friend had, and I thought it turned out pretty well. And it's kind of neat that you can actually play it co-op with multiple players instead of just the single player. I think they simplified the right things. I mean, the game was basically already a card game that you could play, but they just kind of simplified it just enough, I think, to make it translate well to the tabletop.
I've been meaning to look into that game. Got into my 2-player game frenzy this winter also, and I was thinking about buying it, but I luckily prevented myself, and maybe next time.
Hop into the Storm Goblins. Starting off, Cherez, why don't you just give us a couple quick tips for players who are just starting playing the faction?
Yeah, so I think Storm Goblins, I was actually looking through my win rate with them currently, and I think this is a good analogy for the faction. I have, I think, 50 games played, and I have, I think, 15 games lost and 35 games won, and 10 of those 15 losses were in my first 12 games played. So it is one of those factions where, especially when you first play it, you do have to get very much accustomed to the playstyle. It's very similar to, I think, its other goblin cousin, Cave Goblins, where it is a faction where you are going to be playing a certain style, which is different than any other deck, and you can be creative around it, but you do have to adhere to the circuit playstyle. I think it's a deck which is not very bursty, but it is very good at consistent damage. It does have burst potential if a unit is 5 health, 6 health or less, basically. More comfortably, probably like 5, 4 health. In general, the general strategy for newer players would be to build big circuits and then to use Chain Lightning to try to get as much damage on enemy units and summoners as possible. I think it's a deck which, getting a little bit more advanced, which the main thing which I think differentiates really good Storm Goblins players to newer Storm Goblins players is gate placement, where they more so than I think most other factions, are very dependent on their gates to, one, summon units so that they can be in a nice circuit formation, as well as protecting Thrak. Thrak is probably your summoner, is probably card you need to protect the most. It is not combat summoner, definitely. It's a summoner mostly you'll be using for circuit, outside of grounded turns or against factions where you can calculate how much damage they can do to you. But for newer players, or just for anyone playing Storm Goblins, one of the easiest ways to lose with Storm Goblins is for Thrak to get low, thus limiting your options for big circuits.
On the other flip side, that I often think that the best thing to do against Thrak is just punch him at every opportunity that you get. If they leave him out anywhere, just make him pay. That kind of lines up.
Definitely. I think on the flip side, what makes them so cool is that the gate placements, like I said, can be very dynamic. I think they're very much like Fallen Kingdoms in that way. Probably because their summoners are very similar, where they're not really combat summoners. But you, for example, can do like donkey stacks, like stacking gates on top of each other. I think a key gate spot against most factions is usually the B3 gate spot, where that's a nice offensive formation, which still allows you to have summoning spots next to Thrak to make big chains with Vault Swappers. So Vault Swappers are probably the unit you'll be making the most decisions with. And the reason why is because they basically have 3 different functions. The most obvious one is that they are your unit which has the most mobility, and they're your unit which will be composing a majority of your chains. The other option with them is as a discard unit. They are something which I will usually discard at least 2 of them per game to get some magic to power the rest of the deck. They can be used as gate blockers or just space fillers. That is one thing I think Storm Goblins lacks compared to other decks, such as, its polar opposite, maybe Fungal Dwarves. They, because they hurt their own units, sometimes struggle with surrounding Thrak with units to prevent him from getting hit. So that's why I'm saying, in general, your gate positions and Thrak's positioning is very important, because majority of your units you'll be either killing in one turn, such as Vault Swappers, or with Witches and Kite Riders, you'll be slowly dwindling them. Vault Swappers, I guess their less common use would be to basically block opponents' gate spots outside of circuit, as well as just protecting Thrak, angles of Thrak they can get hit from. Probably in terms of the next most important card after Vault Swappers, I would say are your Witches. I try not to discard any of the Witches, and ideally I try to get at least one back with Recharge, which I'll be going into a little bit later. Witches are your primary damage dealing unit. With Overcharge, even without Overcharge, they are very cost effective. They're a 4/1, and as soon as they take a damage, they can become 3/3s. I think Water D actually has a really nice guide on SW Zone for fundamentals of Storm Goblins, and he kind of goes into how cost effective Witches are. So Witches are going to be your primary burst unit. A lot of times, that said, especially if it's early on in a game, I like summoning Witches and not actually circuiting them, forcing your opponent to attack them. 4 damage usually takes 2 attacks at least to destroy for most factions. And if you bring it down to 3 health, then usually a lot of factions can kill a Witch in 1 attack. So that's a decision you'll have to make with Witches. That said, Witches, ideally, you try to either get a Witch or one of your champions to get a big hit on your opponent's summoner. That is sort of usually how I get the opponent's summoner to around lethal range, whether from either 10 health to 6 with a circuit. Yeah, so Witches are your big damage dealer, as well as, and there is a little bit of choice you have to do with how you use them. Next up in importance, I would say, is the Striders. Striders, usually because they're 2 magic, you do have to discard normally 1, but the more you can summon, the happier you are. These are going to be your protectors of Thrak, as well as can allow you to do some very crazy chains because of their tireless ability, where they do not count towards 3 moves you can make per turn. Usually you'll want 1 in front of Thrak as a way to protect front sprout of Thrak, as well as to create a circuit. I try to summon as many as possible. In some matchups, it is, I think, more important to summon more Striders than it is, for example, any of the champions. Usually in matchups where they can burst a champion 6 health champion down in 1 turn with a few resources. In that case, a lot of times, normally it's more important to just summon 2 Striders rather than 1 champion. And then finally, we have the Kite Riders. Kite Riders are units which I think I discard by far the most. It's a very interesting unit. It's kind of like the Goblin version, I guess, of the Climber, or the Cave Goblin version of the Climber, or the Sand Goblins version of the Biter, where it has this ability it has the flight ability where it can go through gates, it can go across units. Majority of the time, I only use Kite Riders to protect Thrak, to clog up space, for example, to clog a flank of Thrak, or to clog a gate spot. I rarely try to attack with them, just because there's a 3rd chance that they will hurt themselves. There are some very specific positions where, especially if you're far behind, where you might want to pray for a 3rd chance of damaging a bunch of units. But majority of the time, it's not worth going for that. And I've even had completely destroyed chains, not realizing if you overcharge and then Kite Ride can destroy a blocker. But yeah, Kite Riders are a lot more situational. The only time I'll really attack with them is if they're attacking a summoner, or if it's the last key damage to kill a common.
The Kite Riders, I feel like, are sometimes just a body for the circuit. I mean, you just electrocute them to death, and they're just 4 health. You slowly, because they're very good at, like you said, plugging those holes in your circuit, and their attack's not great, and sometimes it can be counterproductive to your circuit, taking some of your own stuff out, or they can get to spots that you need, and they do fit in well to plug the spots in the circuit and just get those connections. If you don't have the Volt Swappers, Kite Riders are a decent second for doing that.
Completely agreed. Like you said, that's probably their primary function, to allow the circuit to reach more units.
Yeah, and I feel like with their commons, especially, Storm Goblins sometimes struggle with damage output. So if you don't have those witches, or if you don't have overcharge, and you have to deal with like a very high health unit, like a Shonk, a big champion, I know when they play against Sand Goblins, dealing with Mega Gate is even worse because they can't even chain lightning Mega Gate. But dealing with high health units, I feel like sometimes is one of the things that Storm Goblins struggle with a lot because they don't have a ton of that damage output. Like you said, they have consistent damage output, but they don't have that high end damage output. They can't do like 10 damage most turns.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's their main weakness, is that 5 health and less is usually where they're comfortable with killing, and usually that also just takes multiple attacks to deal with. And that's why they struggle with factions which have high health units that are not clumped.
But can jump into the events. Which event do you want to talk about first? Overcharge?
Yeah, we can go to Overcharge. So Overcharge is probably their coolest event, tied with Recharge. So Overcharge, again, it adds 1 to each numeral in the text of a friendly lightning abilities. So the most basic version of it is that it makes your chain lightning do 2 damage instead of 1. This is really nice because this is where your burst potential is. Usually at least once, I'll play both of them, and usually one of them will involve 1 or 2 witches, allowing them to go from 3 ranged dice to 4 ranged dice. And this will be your main burst. Ideally, you try to get this on their summoner, or, like Aaron said, a high health champion or unit they have to clear it. As well as Overcharge, to go into the champions, allows you to do some really nuts things with all 3 of your champions, allowing a Braca to go in additional space, Ball Lightning to do additional damage, and Izik to pull units from 4 spaces rather than 3, which allows for some crazy, crazy plays. So yeah, Overcharge, I always try to play both, even if they're both in my starting hand. I don't think you can discard it. It just gets rid of too much of your burst potential. Maybe against Phoenix Elves, I can make an argument with. Their summoners at 9 health if if you only have events in your hand. But even then, ideally you play both. Next, I will go actually into Recharge. So Recharge is the other event, which you'll try to play both of. And I've even played Recharge without any Volt Swappers in my discard to get units back. A neat trick you can do as Storm Goblins is you can attack your own units. Outside of Striders and Champions, you're able to attack your own unit to bring them down to 1 or 2 health, so that Chain Lightning will bring them back and they won't go discard pile. Recharge also allows you to get Vault Swappers in positions where you do not have gates, allowing for some really giant chains. I think I've had a few games where I've only used Recharge purely to just protect Thrak on 2 flanks with Vault Swappers, or at least to get Vault Swappers to surround a gate, my opponent's gate, so they can't summon anything. So there's very cool things you can do with Recharge, and even if they're both in your starting hand, you do want to try to find out a way to use both. Next, I'll go into Grounded. You are able to place your summoner in the back row. Usually, this is used to either protect Thrak. If they're overextended, the next turn your opponent can punish Thrak for their positioning. I think majority of the time, I actually use it as a filler card. So, for example, if there's a turn where Thrak potentially would have to retreat and take inactivity damage, sometimes it's actually better to push Thrak forward, get a very nice chain by himself and attack, and then just pull him back to safety. And I think I've surprised a few of my opponents by doing that. And this is a play you can do even with 0 magic, because Grounded doesn't cost anything. Majority of the time, though, I think I usually discard 1 Grounded, unless it is a matchup where I feel like I'll have to push up more than once. But usually, I guess my strategy with Storm Goblins is initially try to push up, get damage on the summoner, and then push back, and pushing back a lot of times is dealing with Grounded. Lastly, the event I'll talk about is Discharge. Discharge is probably the most situational. out of cards used of events. So discharge costs a magic to kill a damaged unit 3 spaces in front of your summoner during the magic phase. Again, discharge, you need to think if you're going to use it, because discharge you can also discard for a magic. So basically, it technically is 2 magic value if you use it. In which case, you want to try to use it on either a 2 cost or a 3 cost. So, for example, it's really good against Smashers in the Tundra Orc deck. Probably one of the only good cards you have in that matchup. But if you're, for example, against Cave Goblins or factions which are summoning a lot of 0 to 1 cost, commons, a lot of times it's more useful to discard it to be able to have more magic for the turn afterwards. It is one of those cards also very situational. A lot of times I will think it's a matchup where I will discard both, but I might end up in a turn where I can't kill a unit completely and it can attack Thrak, in which case it is then worth to use the discharge to save Thrak if your dice did not roll well that turn.
Do you have any specific scenarios that you normally, against certain factions, you normally use discharge more than others?
Yeah, definitely. I think the 2 who come to mind easiest are against Savannah Elves. If there's a 7 health lion or a 6 health lion, it feels really good to get rid of it, especially do a damage to it with the chain, not even attack it, and then discharge it at the end of the turn. Another one, like I said, Tundra Orc, to try to get rid of Smashers. Smashers are especially annoying for Storm Goblins because you don't have that many swords you roll. So their sluggish ability is not as detrimental to them when it's all ranged dice hitting them. Because you're not rolling, you can't roll specials with Chain Lightning. It doesn't actually affect them. The last one I can think about is recently I was playing against Isle Vikid. If you can discharge a Crab Knight, it always feels really good. Or
like a Dancer, maybe?
Dancer would also be nice, yeah. Or if you can, I guess back when it was allowed, if you were able to discharge a Mega Machinist, with the Moto Boots on, that always feels really good. I guess the other cool thing about discharge is you can potentially discard, if you have 0 magic at the end of your turn, you can discard a card to recuperate the magic of discharge. So if you have 0 magic, you can discard a card, play discharge, and you'll get the magic back.
Does destroy, right? So you do get 1 magic refunded when you used it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Essentially doesn't cost 1.
Yeah, you can tell I play Storm Goblins a lot.
I mean, you play a lot of factions which wreck Storm Goblins.
Yeah, we could probably get into that later, which factions do give them trouble.
So I think champions, really well designed. I think all 3 of them are very playable. I think it's very best off preference, and I'm curious which champion you guys like the most. I think majority of people like Braca and Izek the most. I am an Izek enjoyer. I try to summon it as long as it's not on my starting hand. If I had a hand with all 3, I think majority of the time I would summon Izek, just because Lightning Pull is such... if it was in any other deck, I feel like Izek would be the most busted card. But because Thrak has Circuit and you need to play around damaging your own champions, it's not as busted Storm Goblins as it is in other decks.
I think Ezek's very strong. I think he's I know I always bring up deck building, but I definitely think in the decks that can run it symbols-wise, Ezek is a very strong choice. He's just a cheaper Varn that's a little more specified in terms of when he can be used. It's just during the movement phase, but it's a real strong champion for sure.
100%. One thing I remember when I was first trying this deck, and I think I was playing Prophet. Prophet told me, and I completely agree with this, great advice, do not put your own champions into Circuit, unless it's Braca, who has a Lightning Ward. But do not, if you can, try to kill your own champions, unless you're going for some high damage play, you're getting a lot of value out of it. Izek is amazing, especially if you have a forward gate, where Lightning Pull allows you to give Thrak incredible range, potentially with Overcharge. Thrak has a range of 7, which is almost from one end of the board to the other. It is a very good unit to create amazing chains, or also to finish off a summoner. If they're low and just hiding in a corner, you can surprise them with Izek. The other useful thing Izek can do is you can basically use it to play keep away with Thrak, where if Thrak is in a very dangerous position, you can use Izek to get to the other side of your opponent's gates or your own gates. Or if Wayfarers has you surrounded, Izek can pull Thrak to safety. Next up, I guess, is Braca. Braca, I think, is a little bit more situational than Izek, just because a lot of factions can get rid of Braca in a single turn with 6 health. So Braca special ability is that 1, it doesn't get affected by Chain Lightning, and 2, Lightning Speed, which allows it to move 4 spaces or 5 if you have Overcharge. Braca I'll mostly use in general. 1, if I have abundance of magic and I want to use it as basically a better Strider. But majority of the time, I think 90% of the time, I'm using it as a way to get 3 damage or 3 dice on my opponent's summoner. You're able to, with its giant movement, get into places which your opponent, if they don't play around it, probably is not expecting. And I think also a lot of times when playing against Storm Goblins, you're not really expecting them to, you're not really playing around champions, I think a lot of times. At least you might play around one of them, but not multiple of them. I know Shoots likes also playing at least 2 champions per game. One of them is usually Braca, just because of its ability to move so much in a turn, its threat range. Basically like a better Sprocket. Yeah, I guess that's a way of putting it. Last, and probably the most situational, though if you're able to use it well, can do some really amazing damage, is Skiz. So Skiz, Ball Lightning basically allows you to do damage from Skiz to a unit on the opposite side of another unit. So anything in between those takes damage. It's actually, if you can get it off, a very nice way of giving damage to your opponent's units without damaging your own units. Because basically Ball Lightning will affect everything between Skiz and your other unit, but it will not actually affect Skiz or the unit on the opposite side. It's hard to say without drawing a diagram. Usually you'll be using Skiz with Volt Swappers or, as Aaron pointed out, Kite Riders. Between Chain Lightning and Ball Lightning, you can do 2 damage, so basically an overcharge. Or if you play overcharge, you can surprise people by doing 4 damage immediately to every unit between Skiz and its target. This is probably the main way that Storm Goblins can deal with high health units, Skiz plus Chain Lightning. The main problem with Skiz, even more so than Izek, is that it's hard to prevent him from being involved with Chain Lightning. So basically, from immediately becoming a 5/3 champion for 4, which is not as nice. Keeping Skiz alive, a little bit hard sometimes, but if you're able to use it, you can do some crazy damage.
Yeah, I think Skiz is the one that I tend to use the least amount. I try and use Skiz. I just can never get those setups where I think it's going to be super beneficial. It might be better against factions that clump a ton, but even factions that clump a ton are going to try and not clump against Storm Goblins. So I don't see use for Skiz as much as I would like to. Skiz has a fun ability, and it's really great when you can get it to go off. But for the most time, I use Braca and Ezek. I use Ezek as like my more staple champion, and I use Braca as either like a finisher or I have the magic and I'm going to use him as an extender. Because Braca as basically a Gust Strider sometimes is pretty useful. You can just use that for a while and then get him into the fray when you need him.
100%. Skiz, to your point, Aaron, is one of those units or champions where you want to get immediate value from it. So if you can get, 3 or 4 magic out of it the turn you summon it, then you can summon it, because then it doesn't need to live longer than that. But if you can't see that value, like you said, as soon as it's summoned, after that, your opponent's going to play around it every turn. So you better be getting a lot of value from it the turn you summon Skiz. Which you can with Storm Goblins, I guess. That's the amazing thing about Storm Goblins. If you create some giant chain and Skiz in there, you can easily, especially with Overcharge, you can kill a bunch of 4-cost units, which your opponent probably thinks are completely safe.
Common units against Storm Goblins are never safe. Those bigger high health targets that sometimes are tough. I love playing Crimson Order, seeing a bunch of cultists come out, or seeing a bunch of carriers come out with fungal dwarves and
just immediately zapping them.
Everything dies. They all die.
I think with Storm Goblins, all it takes sometimes, for example, I was facing Chibata once, who was playing Savannah Elves, and I felt like I was going really far behind. But then I just had that one amazing overcharge turn where I hit all their units, and I was able to kill and damage 4 or 5 of their units, and that just completely changed the game around from being a losing situation to a winning situation. I guess we'll go into that later, but that is something, as a Storm Goblins player, you can look forward to, and as a Storm Goblins opponent, you want to kind of avoid. Sometimes it just takes that one overcharge turn to completely shift the balance of the game.
Yeah, and I have found, I mentioned that Braca can be a good finisher, but I have won a couple of games with Ezek just reaching things that people did not think was possible. Which can be a good way to, if the summoner's real low, give just a couple health or 2. I had one where I had been surviving slowly. I think I was playing Tundra Orcs against Tundra Orcs, and I got to the end game, and Grognak had 2 or 3 health, and I, final couple turns, found a way to get an overcharged turn with Ezek and got Thrak right up against Grognak, and that was game over.
That's incredible. I had a game, I think, in League. This was when Storm Goblins first came out. My poor opponent was able to basically make my opponent take inactivity damage until they died, just by kiting around with Thrak and Izek around their main gate.
Jeez. That was wild.
That was a fun one.
What are some tips for like how to best use chain lightning? Because chain lightning can be difficult to use because a lot of times you'll leave yourself very open to a counter attack if you take out too many of your own units. How do you best use it, and do you use it every turn? When do you use it effectively?
Yeah, great question. I think almost every turn you do want to try to use chain lightning. I think the difference is how many units do you want to get in your circuit before you use it, and not being too greedy with it. Like you said, I think the main thing you're always trying to leverage is what is Thrax's health, as well as what is the health of the units protecting Thrak. If it's Striders, you're good to go. But for example, if it's Kite Riders or Witches, you don't want to bring that unit which is protecting Thrak low enough where it can die and then your opponent can get damage on Thrak. It is kind of the fun of playing Storm Goblins, and I think what makes such a fun puzzle, like a kind of a different fun puzzle compared to other factions, is trying to leverage the amount of chain lightning damage you can get, specifically on their summoner. You do want to, if possible, try to get their summoner down to 6 or lower, in which case they have to always be very careful, especially if you have an overcharge left, of their summoner being exposed. And like you said, an Izek or a Braca assassination. I think in general, try to get as many units as you can into a circuit without overextending Thrak is probably the majority of turns, I guess, is the way I look at it. And I think that's why, for example, gate placement is so important with Storm Goblins. The bigger your chains or bigger your circuits, the more damage you're doing, and the easier it is to finish off the opponent's summoner and other units.
Where do you recommend placing the gates?
So I think the first gate in almost every matchup is B3. That is a gate spot which is a little bit more offensive, but it allows Thrak to stand behind that gate and to basically summon units to the side of him to allow for a big chain while having the gate protecting Thrak's front spot. Another common one I always use is a 5 health gate stacked on top of my 10 health gate. I think that's a very common one. And then Thrak is usually in either the forward or the backward spot of that, usually the forward spot of that. And then you're able to summon Vault Swappers behind Thrak or Kite Riders behind Thrak to add to your chain, as well as protecting that flank of Thrak. Outside of that, unless I'm getting pushed on, I usually will have 1 or 2 gates, which are past the third row, usually like in my opponent's side of the board, close to my opponent's side of the board. That way you can summon units to allow for chains, which can threaten your summoner if they're hiding in the back. I rarely, and I honestly think it's not the best, unless you are doing it for Thrak safety, summon gates in the back 2 rows of Storm Goblins. Just because that is very detrimental if your opponent decides to retreat to their side of the board.
The gate on top of the 10 health gate is not one that I have seen a whole lot of or even heard about. Is that something you normally use a whole lot? Is it really effective?
Yeah, no, I highly recommend it. I've used that a ton, actually, to pretty good success. I usually use it against decks which I'm playing more in the mid-board for. The idea behind it is that I want to protect that side of Thrak without expending a unit. As well as it allows for some nice, basically because of the mobility of Storm Goblins, gate positioning, in terms of for other factions, you don't want to block the forward gate spot there. But because almost all of Thrak's units, beside Witches, have some type of mobility amplification, you can afford that. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it.
Yeah, placing gates on top of each other is wild. It's not something I do very often because I'm used to maybe a different sort of aggression. I think in general, the Storm Goblins break a lot of the rules that we normally think about the way the board functions and the way things are working.
I guess we can call it the Cherez stack. If people start doing it, I'll take credit for it.
The Cherez stack is using your own gate as cover for your gate.
Exactly.
Instead of your opponent's gates as cover for your units. It's just, we'll just protect our gate with their gate.
Do you ever go more than 2? Do you ever do a third gate?
On top of it?
Yeah.
I don't think I've done it, but there are situations where I could see doing it. I think one of the reasons why I work well with Storm Goblins, I am not someone, and this is actually a detriment to me, is I am someone who thinks I'm most 2 turns ahead. And usually I'm thinking of how much value can I get within those, 2 turns. A gate there can, for my opponent's turn, just protect me, as well as allow me to get a giant chain. Yeah, I can post maybe some replays in Discord so people can see, because I've quite a few.
I'd be interested in seeing it. But why don't we hop into which of the matchups do you think are some of like Storm Goblin's best matchups? Like if someone's just starting out with the faction and they want an easier time of it, what factions do you think they should play against?
Yeah, great question. I think, sort of as we alluded to earlier, Storm Goblins have some of the most polar matchups there are. They have some matchups where they feel like they'll win 70, 80, 90% of the time, and there's matchups where they feel like they'll lose that much. The matchups which are relatively easy for them are matchups which units intrinsically clump, and also matchups which do not have a lot of mobility. So in this case, Fungal Dwarves, Vanguards are great examples. Forge are another good example where they always want to create a formation, which allows for multiple units to be affected by Circuit and Chain Lightning. Other decks which are on the easier side, Phoenix Elves, because their summoner has 9 health, makes it a lot easier to get 9 health down to the lethal range of around 6 or 5 or lower than it is, for example, with Grognak.
Yeah.
Which has 14 health. Another one which is relatively easier is Cave Goblins. The main reason why is a lot of their units just die instantly to Circuit. You don't need to do any attacks. Any type of slinger just dies instantly. It only has 1 turn of value usually. Other than that, easier factions, for example, not as easy as the factions I listed, but for example, Skyspear Avians, again, they are a more formation-based faction, as well as their summoner only has 10 health to start out with. They are a little bit more tricky to play around just because you do have to be very careful of Sky Assault. Thrak doesn't need to be positioned behind a gate majority of the game. Recently, and I think this might be a little bit more contentious, but I think they have a really good matchup into Spectral Conclave. I think you have to play a lot more defensive early on, and normally I try to go for circuits on the summoner. But against Spectral Conclave, I think I've had a lot of success just playing a lot more conservatively and only creating circuits only if the opponent's allowing me to, not really overextending to get any circuits on Faerun, just because of the burst potential through Unleash and other shenanigans. I think I usually play against Spectral Conclave a very more passive, very magic denial playstyle. I've had some good success with that.
So what do you think are there tougher matchups then? I mean, the one I have experience with that I'd say the two that come to my mind are probably Wayfarers and Tundra Orcs, but that's just because those factions are some that I play and they don't need to clump up and they tend to hit hard in certain locations. So that's something that Thrak doesn't like, but I don't know if there's any others or if you agree.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. I think by far the hardest matchup is Tundra Orcs. And the main reason is that, like you said, Grognak has 14 health. Majority of their units have a lot of health besides Chargers. But outside of Chargers, it's 3, 4, and 6 health commons. And their champions, especially Shank, is 11 health. Good luck trying to get through that as Storm Goblins. It's going to take at least 3 turns to even try to kill Shank, on top of trying to get damage on Grognak. If you are playing Tundra Orcs against Storm Goblins and you want to almost free win, rush at them. Spread out your units a little bit, but just rush at them. You'll have a very good time. I think that matchup is heavily Tundra Orcs favored. I think it's almost impossible without a good amount of luck for Storm Goblins to win that matchup. Same thing, like you said, with Wayfarers. Celeste doesn't have as much health as Grognak, but at the same time, Wayfarers can play a lot more spread out, and they also have a lot of tools to get to Thrak if he tries to play more defensively behind gates. Just all the typical Wayfarers tips and tricks. It's one of those matchups where you're sort of punching each other, but at the same time, Wayfarers can do a lot more damage every turn than the little pings that Storm Goblins can do every turn. Some other really bad matchups are Sand Goblins, Shadow Elves, and Filth. But Filth is an interesting one where you have to play it the right way. Otherwise, I think it's Storm Goblins favored. For the first two, Shadow Elves, it's for the same reasons Wayfarers are really good against them, if not even worse because of gate manipulation. One thing Storm Goblins hate is gates because you can't do circuit through gates. Shadow Elves have multiple different ways of adjusting gate positions, bringing back gates, as well as they have the other thing which Storm Goblins hates, which is assassination. They have a lot of ways of assassinating. All that Shadow Elves has to do is get Thrak low enough early on before they're able to get too much damage on Solendar, and they should have a very comfy time of winning that game. Darkness is just really good. It always feels really bad to have a Strider Darkness. Sand Goblins, again, I think it's a thing where Sand Goblins are able to manipulate their gates through thrusters. Mega Gate is just very effective, and it's a matchup. I think as Sand Goblins, you do want to try to keep all your 5 health gates. It's not a lot of times when I play Sand Goblins, I know other people they will discard their 5 health gates. This is actually a matchup where you probably do want to play a few of them just to keep Crust safe from Circuit. They also have multiple different ways through biters, typical Sand Goblins, burn hot, a lot of ways of getting Thrack low, in which case it's more dangerous to try to get bigger circuits.
Yeah, and with Sand Goblins, one of the last times I played this matchup was in the league against Shibata, and he just ran at me with Sparks that was full of Wrench Rats. I think he loaded up like 4 Wrench Rats, and I didn't have the damage to take down Sparks fully in one turn, and even if I did, I needed like Thrack next to him, or like one of my champs that I needed to like survive next to him. I think it was Braca. And I was like, either I take Sparks down and take 4 damage on the face, or next turn he had thrust already on him, so next turn he just finds me anyway and detonates. Or if like I didn't do the damage, then I put all those attacks into Sparks anyway, and then he detonates anyway. It's like it was a lose-lose situation. It was rough.
That's cool. I've never thought of a Sparks strat. I mean, I think that, like you said, there's multiple different ways. Even like Clink sounds so good. You basically are negating Circuit every turn by repair. Sand Goblins has a lot of tools. So Filth is interesting, and the reason why Filth is interesting because Storm Goblins are probably pretty comfy into it until Filth summons Abomination, and then it's almost impossible for Storm Goblins to win. Abomination might be like the biggest counter to Storm Goblins. You will never be able to kill this thing, and you're kind of like on a timer, I guess is the way of putting it. You have like 5 turns left to win until Abomination gets all the upgrades necessary to, just kill Thrack wherever it is. Just 11 health, able to heal every turn, able to get all the different abilities that the mutants have. Horror Mutants, a nightmare. Other than that, I think before Abomination comes, I think Storm Goblins are able to deal with the cultists very easily. So most of them have 2 health, which means that they're free food for Storm Goblin Circuit, especially Overcharge, if you're able to get a lot of them. In a Circuit, Anointed Cultists also can really focus them because the other units will be just dying to Circuit. And that just leads to Spew is not that useful against Storm Goblins normally, just because Storm Goblins don't usually have that many units on the board during opponents' turns. Horror is pretty good, just because basically it makes it so that... Actually, Horror is not the best in retrospect, because you already get rid of one of the health through Circuit. Still solid, I think. Bestial, I think you can kite out. Tentacle is always good. Bursting, again, has limited effectiveness unless you're going for Assassination Attempt. At least the way I play Storm Goblins, usually there's not that many units on the board, at least early on. So you're able to get Demigod sometimes low, but then as soon as Abomination gets on the board, you're on a timer as Storm Goblins.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You touched a little bit on like what cards you tend to discard for Magic with them. Why don't you dive a little deeper into that and let the people know exactly what cards you like to get rid of? And because I feel like the economy for Storm Goblins is actually pretty tight, and that's another reason why when you face like the Shadow Elves or the Sand Goblins and they deny you some magic, and you're like, no, I needed that for the 3 units I had to summon to make my circuit work.
Yeah, no, great point. Especially because you always want to threaten Overcharge, I think is the other thing. So if you're down to 1 magic, your opponent knows you can either do Overcharge or you can summon a unit. So you always want to have, I think it's one of those factions you do want to comfortably have 3 magic at the end of every one of your turns, if possible. 2 magic is also fine, but ideally 3 or more. I usually almost always discard the first champion I get, unless for some reason I already have 4 magic at that time. Kite Riders and Volt Swappers are probably the 2 units you'll discard the most, as well as matchup dependent discharges you'll be discarding. Usually 1 grounded I'll discard. I will almost always discard 1 Strider, but it never feels good to. Ideally, you try to summon as many Striders as possible. Majority of the time, it's going to be discharges, a grounded, or champions, Volt Swappers, and Kite Riders.
It's interesting that you say you discard Volt Swappers. Is it just because you can get them back with recharge?
Yeah, exactly. Majority of the time, if I need magic and I haven't played a recharge yet, I will be discarding Volt Swappers because you'll anyways be getting them back. And also, a lot of times, using a Volt Swapper to get an additional damage or extending the chain to 1 more unit is not worth it unless it's the summoner. The question is it worth a magic or 1 damage? And a lot of times, 1 magic is worth more than 1 damage.
I'll do that on occasion when I find that I'm strapped for like I have a recharge early on and I don't have a ton of Volt Swappers that have been like dying. If I get a couple and I don't need them that turn, I'll discard them just so I can use them in that recharge. similar for like, I'll do the same thing with a different faction and fungal dwarves with release of spores. If I don't need the carrier that turn and I have release of spores, I'll discard so I can get more spores out, more carriers out.
Great point. I also think it can be also a little bit dynamic. For example, if I'm going for the win, I will be discarding more Striders than I will, for example, Kite Riders, just because Kite Riders are more mobile. So if my opponent is down to 3 or 4 health on their summoner, then Striders are a lot less useful than Kite Riders or Vault Swappers. It is dynamic. But yeah, the one unit you never discard is Witches. Witches, try to play them all.
I mean, that's the only range common, and it hits the hardest, right?
Exactly.
Some of the champions are ranged too, right?
Izik and Skiz, yeah. And Braca might as well be ranged with the...
He just throws himself, shoots himself across the board.
The most ranged melee unit.
Exactly.
I think we've touched on a lot of the Storm Goblin aspects. I want to also touch a little bit on the fact that you are one of the only Summoner Wars streamers. How did that come about? What made you want to stream Summoner Wars?
So that's a funny story. So basically, I used to be a lot of times on Ben 10 stream back when he would stream a year ago. And I really enjoyed talking about Summoner Wars, specifically competitive Summoner Wars. And not just competitive Summoner Wars, but just people coming up with very creative ideas. I think that's one of the main reasons I love Summoner Wars is just seeing, of course, top level play, but also just seeing people go for that 30% play, but which is very creative and cool. So going for if you hit the 4 swords, then you can do something crazy, but otherwise you look stupid, right? I would stream with Ben a lot, or I would be on his streams. And when he left, I think Eden used to do a lot of events with Ben 10. And then once he stopped playing, Eden approached me and was like, hey, would you be interested in streaming? And at first I was a little bit hesitant, but then afterwards, after doing a little bit of research how it would work, I decided I wanted to. And I think the original reason I was a little bit hesitant is because I thought I would have to be Ben 10 in terms of like Ben 10 was amazing at streaming very regularly, streaming his games, and for me that's not as interesting. What I like doing when I stream, which is basically interacting with the community, talking about competitive play as well as talking about cool games they have. And so I think when I realized that I want to stream, but I want to stream for what's enjoyable for me, that's when I started to stream a lot on Twitch, post the VODs on YouTube.
Just for everyone at home, what's your Twitch channel name?
Cherez Summoner Wars, I think. So just my name, SW. Cherez SW on Twitch.
So just taking over that mantle for Ben 10?
Yeah, I really like streaming competitive games, especially live games. It's really fun to talk to players in general about their thoughts about the game, and just we have a very nice, tight-knit community. I think everyone I've streamed with or co-streamed with has been very fun to talk to, very enjoyable. Whether it's talking Summoner Wars or whether it's talking Nestle's amazing drawings of Grognak kissing Hecatea, it's all fun.
Do you ever think that you'll branch more into like the YouTube video aspect, or do you think you'll just post the VODs on there and just continue streaming occasionally on Twitch?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that. I think YouTube VODs might be better just because I think I did Twitch just because that was the first thing which came to my mind. But after looking at YouTube streams, I think it's nicer for the viewer. At least personally, I like YouTube streams better because it's easier to rewind. I think it's also easier to just post them on, because a lot of times I'll stream on Twitch and then completely forget about the VOD. So I think I would like to at some point maybe dual stream or switch to YouTube.
You said Storm Goblins have a bunch of up and down matchups. Where do you think they fall overall in terms of the like if you were to do a tier list, or what place would you put them? Are they kind of in the middle? Or are they above the middle? Where would you place them overall?
Yeah, no, that's a super interesting question. So Vexer has, I think you guys have both seen it. Vexer has his tier list, and I think the most controversial one is that Fungal Dwarves are S tier. And the way he explains it, at least how I understand it, is that Fungal Dwarves in general just have very powerful cards with effects. And just in isolation, like if you didn't know any other decks, Fungal Dwarves just have a very powerful looking deck in terms of what the champions can do, etc. The problem is that like almost every faction which has been released after Fungal Dwarves seems to have a good matchup into them. Or Aaron, you're the expert, I guess. Do you agree with that assessment? Or
I was talking to when we had on Beast for the Shimmer Sea Fae, how like of the past 6-8 factions that got released, the Shimmer Sea Fae might be their best matchup, and it's still like Shimmer Sea Fae favored by like probably like 5% or so, maybe a little less, but it's wild because some of the matchups have been crazy. Storm Goblins and Spectral Conclave are in the general play data like 75%. against the Fungal Dwarves. The worst matchups in the game are Fungal Dwarves versus Storm Goblins and Spectral Conclave. So it's great. They're doing just fine.
There's two different paths, right? Fungal Dwarves are really good against Wayfarers, right? In general.
No, they are good against them. Oh, maybe I'm thinking more Crimson Order. I'd say it's at worst 7-3, but maybe more like 6-5, like 6.5. Like it's good. It's a good match. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
I don't think it's that bad.
Yeah.
I would say it's probably like 57-43 or 60-40. Probably 60-40. It's like a solid matchup for Fungal Dwarves. But like one of Fungal Dwarves' biggest weaknesses is like one of Wayfarer's biggest strengths. And that's like a quick start. The Fungal Dwarves take a while to get up and going. So if you're Wayfarers and you get a good quick start against them and you get up close and personal, you get like a gate up there and they can really, really struggle with that. So like if the game goes longer, like if it's past the halfway point, it's probably leans a fair amount like Fungal Dwarves. But the beginning part is the real struggle for Fungal Dwarves. If you are very aggressive against Fungal Dwarves, they struggle, which you wouldn't think might be the case because they have this giant fungal army they can just grow out of your own units. But hit them quick and hard, and they don't know what to do. They got nothing.
It sounds like what Cherez was going to say is he thinks that like Storm Goblins and Fungal Dwarves are like the opposite decks, right? Is that where you're going?
Similar, where it's like, it might not be opposite, but like they're both decks which are very, like their power level very much depends on the other deck which are in the pool, I guess. And also like I guess their win rate, for example, in the Plat Hat tournament or in a tournament, is very dependent on the popular decks of that time. So, for example, if all of a sudden, like you said, Fungal Dwarves, Vanguards, and Phoenix Elves become the top decks and everyone brings those, then Storm Goblins will be S tier, right? Because they just have very good matchups into all three of those. Versus if Wayfarers and Tundra Orcs become the meta and other decks like that, they'll struggle a lot. I think by themselves, I would put them as like A- tier because they have really good tools against. They don't have tools against everything, but the tools they have are amazing for the specific situations they can deal with. Versus like I see like an A tier faction such as like Mountain Vargath. I see that just like it's a very well balanced. It has tools for almost every situation. It might not be the best tools, but it can deal with that. There's certain situations, especially like if Thrak gets low early on, you just can't really do too much as Storm Goblins. That's my impression. That said, with the right luck, it is a faction where there is a lot of skill expression. There are ways to sort of circumvent its downsides with clever play and also good luck.
I don't know. People know now that you were selected for the. I mean, it might be too early to say, or by the time the Tournament of Champions, and by the time this comes out, some of your games will have been played. But what do you feel about the matchups you've got in the pool? I'm just looking at them. It seems like you've got some decent matchups.
Yeah, no, I'm actually curious what you guys both think.
You got Aaron's Swamp Orcs, Artebrie's Heavy High Elves, Elkanella's Fungal Dwarves, Devlinfish Skyspear Avians, Shadow Elves, which is probably tough as you said, and then the Forged. So yep. I feel like a few of those are ones you said are good, at least Fungal Dwarves and Forged, probably.
Yeah.
Skyspear Avians maybe even. It's just kind of like you're both punching each other until someone dies. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that matchup is, if I can draw gates, I'm favored. If I don't draw gates, then it's probably pretty even. / I need to be a little bit careful.
I think that one probably leans Storm Goblins, but and High Elves is not bad either because you can use your damage to take out pieces.
Yeah, exactly. And also you have to be careful of Strong Aura where you can get some Volt Swappers. The same thing with Biters, right? You can get the 2 damage Biters / Volt Swappers, which do crazy damage. Then you have like lethal range at 9 or 8.
And if they throw in like Loyalty, like that's another attack.
Exactly.
Or
Liberty is crazy.
Yeah, Liberty is good.
And Swamp Orc seems like a weird one, but I'm talking to both the people playing this one. But like, I'm not the greatest Swamp Orc or Storm Goblin player, but it seems like Swamp Orcs want to have a lot of guys on the board, so that's a lot of stuff that can get zapped. So you kind of have to probably play them a bit differently than normal. And also, Swamp Orcs can hit really hard; they can hit Thrak, but Thrak doesn't want to be where Muglug can do that. That should be an interesting one, I think.
Yeah. I think.
You guys probably don't want to talk about it.
I can talk about it a little bit. I think you definitely want to play different Swamp Orcs. Like you said, I think you lose if you just clump all together unless you have a very strong start. Orange Lazarus versus XIX did that matchup, and it came to the wire. I think it's pretty back and forth. I wouldn't say it's leaning one way or the other. I think it's one of those things where over time it'll be more Swamp Orcs favored, but maybe I'm wrong. As people, learn the matchup.
Yeah, I think it might be slightly Swamp Orcs favored. I think it's fairly close. I haven't played it a whole lot, so that'll be interesting. I don't know if I even have a single play in that matchup. Because there's so many matchups nowadays, you can't play all of them.
And Storm Goblins kind of seem to decline in popularity after their season.
Yeah, I never face Storm Goblins in the public queue, so I do not have a lot of matchups against Storm Goblins. I like even with like Fungal Dwarves, who I play the most, I only have like 2 matchups against Storm Goblins, and one the player didn't finish the game. So it's like I have one real matchup against Storm Goblins as Fungal Dwarves.
I'm gonna look now, see how many Storm Goblins games I have against.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think Storm Goblins might be one of the best factions to climb ladder with, and I think that's shown in the current data where Doctor Doom is like, there's only 2 factions which are in 1400, and one of them is Storm Goblins. And I think one of the reasons why is because they have a good matchup into Conclave, and Conclave is played a lot, and that's the only other 1400 faction currently. As well as, I think, like you said, a lot of people don't have practice against it, and it's similar to Cave Goblins, where when you're playing against Storm Goblins, you have to play their game, let's say that way. You have to play around their game. Most decks cannot play their own game. And so that's like a learning curve.
Yeah, I just looked. I have about 40 games against Storm Goblins, or 30 something. But interestingly, almost all of them were private game, or about half of them were private games against someone who was working on them. So very few in the open queue.
I have 13 total games against Storm Goblins.
They're a deck where I wouldn't recommend it as someone's first deck, but definitely as a second or third deck. New playstyle. I'm so happy that's in the game. Very different than any other deck. Like I said, I think it can do very well on the ladder. It's also one of those decks, I'm not sure if you guys have the same feeling. It's like when you see it, you're like, damn it. I just want to face, Phoenix Elves. I don't want to play Storm Goblins.
The other deck for me like that right now is like Spectral Conclave. I was like, I don't want to think that much on my turns right now, but now I have to. about how to defend against this faction. It's something about, I think, like the cunning decks seem to do that. My current working theory. Because you got Spectral Conclave, Storm Goblins, Cave Goblins, Wayfarers. They all make you play their game. The only one that doesn't kind of is Cloaks, but even them you really have to worry about. Out of Shadows.
Out of Shadows, yeah. And I think also probably due to the lack of playing, people are just not, like versus Cloaks, people have played, like everyone has like hundreds of games probably versus Cloaks, versus Storm Goblins, like you said. Even both of you who play a lot of games, have very limited experience versus them.
I'm like top, I think, 40 for games played, and James is number 1, and he has 30 real games against Storm Goblins, 25, because half of them are just games he was testing with somebody. This is wild. Everybody should go check out Cherez's Twitch and check out those streams. Once this has been posted, you can check out the game we played between each other. Swamp Orcs versus Storm Goblins in the Tournament of Champions, which is a fun tournament where the best player with each faction goes in head-to-head in massive tournament of epic proportions,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. That was a lot of fun.
Thanks for coming on.
This has been another episode of Discard for Magic, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.